In 1946, a monster tornado obliterated the small town of Woodward, Oklahoma. Many homes, businesses, and lives were lost, and in the middle of the mayhem, a mystery was unfolding that would still be unexplained 77 years later. Let's talk about Joan Gay Croft. Woodward was a town of around 5,500 residents that is in the northwest part of Oklahoma. The night of April 9th, 1946, seemed to be a typical Wednesday night for the small town. The usual activities were going on, but several residents did notice how incredibly muggy and still it was that night. However, before the night was over, the calmness would soon give way to chaos. After the muggy air moved in, an unsettling quiet came over the town. The birds grew silent. The animals seemed restless. A cafe owner looked at his barometer and it had bottomed out. Around 8:40 p.m., the swirling wind picked up and began roaring, bending large trees over and snapping them like toothpicks. The funnel cloud was soon visible and on its way, but there was little the residents could do. They could run for shelter, but sadly most of the shelters would soon fall victim to the tornado as well. Many businesses and homes were caught up in the massive wind and spit out as piles of rubble. The sheer horror of the tornado lasted only about 5 minutes, but for the unsuspecting town, so much destruction had been done. The massive F5 tornado, with winds ranging from 225 to 440 miles an hour, had decimated the city, destroying homes and businesses. By the time the 1.8-mile wide monster storm had left the town, more than 100 people were dead and hundreds more injured. At least 100 city blocks were destroyed. It still stands as the deadliest tornado in Oklahoma history. There was absolutely no warning that the tornado was on its way to the unsuspecting residents. This was in part due to a strike by the National Federation of Telephone Workers. The strike was in its third day and poorly planned, but succeeded in effectively crippling telephone communications, as the network had also been used to disseminate vital weather information. However, with no one at the switchboard to receive notice there was a storm on its way, the tragedy was made even worse. After the storm hit, 8 striking telephone workers agreed to go back to work to help with the crisis. A week later, their union dismissed them. The scene in Woodward after the tornado was utter pandemonium. The 28-bed hospital in Woodward filled up quickly and was soon overwhelmed at the many injured. The more seriously hurt were taken by plane and train to hospitals in nearby Alva and Oklahoma City. The lawn of the hospital was transformed into a temporary morgue as trucks started going up and down the residential streets to collect the dead. Giant bulldozers removed the remains of what had been homes and businesses only 48 hours earlier. The unsettling weather continued as daylight came on April 10th and 3 inches of snow blanketed what was left of the town, making recovery efforts even more difficult. At the house of Olin and Cleta Croft, it was a tragic scene. Their house had been leveled. Cleta Croft, a 26-year-old wife and mother, was killed instantly when a wall in her home fell on her during the tornado. Olin Croft was pinned under the rubble of his demolished home and in critical condition. The 2 young girls, Joan Gay 4 and her older sister Jerry, Cleta's daughter from a previous marriage, had thankfully survived the storm. Jerry had minor injuries and Joan Gay had some facial abrasions as well as a pencil-sized splinter of wood that had completely penetrated her left calf. Their neighbor, Mary Carter, had found the girls and taken them to the Woodward Hospital. As the girls' injuries weren't deemed serious, they were put in the basement of the hospital together on a cot with the other less seriously injured victims until they could receive medical help. While searching for her family members, the girl's aunt Ruth did find Joan Gay and Jerry in the hospital basement. She made sure the girls were okay, being careful to not tell them their mother had been killed, and left them to help other injured people. When she came back the next day to check on her nieces, to her utter shock, Joan Gay was gone. Aunt Ruth questioned Jerry as to what happened to her sister. She said a few hours after they were brought to the hospital after dark, two men dressed in khaki clothing came and took Joan Gay. Some other people witnessed Joan Gay's abduction as well. Joan Gay cried and protested when the men took her, saying, "I don't want to leave my sister." The men told her they would come back for her sister next. When the nurse questioned them, they said they were taking her to an Oklahoma City hospital where other relatives were waiting, so they were allowed to leave. Dressed in a pink and blue sleeper, carried away by two strangers, was the last time Joan Gay Croft was ever seen. With all the turmoil that was going on, it was a few days before Joan Gay's family even realized she was actually missing. Joan Gay's father, Olin Croft, was taken to a hospital to recover from his injuries. Here is a quote from him from a newspaper article about the aftermath of the tornado. "I was still unconscious under the rubble of our house when the children were taken to the Woodward Hospital. Later, I was taken to the same hospital, but I was removed about daylight to the Baker Hospital. Then I was taken to the home of some friends. It was 2 days before I was able to start looking for her personally, but my wife's people began trying to find her as soon as the storm was over. They missed her because they didn't know anyone had been taken to the hospital basement. The next day, she was gone." He, along with Joan Gay's grandfather, went from town to town posting flyers and placing missing person ads on local radio stations. He tried to enlist the FBI, but was told they didn't have jurisdiction unless there was proof positive it was a kidnapping. There was some speculation that Cleta Croft's family may have taken Joan Gay, but there is no evidence to support that, and it appears they were searching for her just as diligently as her father was. After months of searching, Olin did take his stepdaughter Jerry and moved to another town heartbroken. He spent the next 40 years following up every tip he was given as to where Joan Gay might be. Sadly, he died in 1986, having no answers as to what happened to his daughter. There was another tragic occurrence that happened as the result of the tornado. There were 3 children found deceased due to the storm that could not be identified: a 6-month-old baby, a 3 to 4-year-old girl, and a 12-year-old girl. The coroner did ask Joan Gay's Aunt Ruth to view the body of the 3 to 4-year-old child, and she was certain that it was not Joan Gay. I did find mention in an old newspaper article that the evidence was strong the girl close to Joan Gay's age was from a broken home being raised by her grandmother in Woodward. Although the neighbors identified the little girl's body, the grandmother refused to accept it and would not positively ID her. Without the grandmother's identification, the law required the child to be buried in an unmarked grave. There were painstaking efforts made to try to identify the unknown victims of the tornado. They had the teachers in Woodward supply their enrollment books, and every 12-year-old female in town was tracked down and accounted for, and they still could not identify the child. There were theories that perhaps the girl's parents had been killed and no family member was left to identify her, or the family didn't have the money for a funeral, so she was left unclaimed. There were even rumors that perhaps the 3 mystery children were all from the same family. In the years since, a few townspeople have came forward and purchased headstones for the children's grave, but sadly they remain unidentified to this day. Joan Gay Croft's family never gave up searching for her. Renewed interest was made in the case when Unsolved Mysteries aired a segment on her disappearance in 1993. Within 48 hours, Joan Gay's Aunt Ruth received more than 200 calls with potential leads to her niece's whereabouts. A few were particularly intriguing, one woman even having the same scars on the same leg as Joan Gay, and another from Canada claiming to have photographs bearing the name of Olin and Cleta Croft and artwork with Olin Croft's signature, but she no longer had access to them. It appears that ultimately blood tests were able to determine they were both not Joan Gay Croft. Joan Gay's sister Jerry, who has rarely spoken publicly about her sister's case, was quoted in a 1979 article as saying, "Granted, it would be more than a joy if Joan Gay was found through one of these stories, but the chance is less than 1 in a million." Robert E. Lee, who served as news editor of the Woodward County Journal from 1957 to 1967, would often write stories on the anniversary of the disappearance. Sometimes these stories would be distributed by the AP and printed in newspapers nationwide where people would contact the family thinking they were Joan Gay. After writing yet another story on Joan Gay's disappearance on the anniversary, he received this interesting email on April 12, 1999.
Mr. Lee, I know that you have written many articles about the 1947 Woodward tornado and about the missing Joan Gay Croft. How would you like to write an article about what really happened to Joan Gay and where she has been this past 54 years? She has been and is living in Oklahoma City off and on since 1956 under a different name, with the full knowledge of her father, Orlin Croft. She even graduated from an Oklahoma City high school under her different name. If you want more information, please contact Joan Gay at this email address: Miss Joan Gay Croft.
He said the computer staff at the Oklahoman didn't have the technology to trace the email address. He replied to the email and on May 2nd got this response.
Mr. Lee, I know this time of year there are many people who crawl out of the woodwork claiming to be the lost girl, but I was never physically lost. My immediate family knew where I was. I just didn't know who I was. Until just lately, I never faced the fact that Cleta Croft, my mother, died upon me. I buried this information deep within my long-term memory and refused to accept. If you want to know the rest, email me at this address. We will arrange to meet in person to discuss the details. I propose we meet at Penn Square for the first meeting. I would like to meet in public, but not publicly and without photos. Please let me know a time and date convenient for you. I am on the internet on most Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays between 9 and 10:30 a.m. As to compensation, I would prefer none. Yours, Joan Gay Croft.
The reporter quickly responded saying, "Sure, I would like to know more about Joan Gay." The letter writer never responded to that message. Soon after, the email address stopped accepting emails. An interesting twist for sure, but it is unknown whether or not it was just an attention seeker or actually Joan Gay Croft, who after responding got cold feet about revealing herself to the world. Had Joan Gay been alive and well all this time and unaware of her identity until recently? Okay, as for my thoughts on this case, it is a rarity for me as I think there are a handful of plausible theories that could have happened. The first that comes to mind is the Good Samaritan theory. This theory could go a few different ways. I did notice in my research that Olin Croft was actually listed as among the dead in several initial newspaper articles soon after the tornado. Add that with the fact that her mother Cleta was killed instantly, I think there could be a chance someone who knew of the Crofts thought both of Joan Gay's parents were dead and thought they would raise her. In fact, his sister Nellie was mentioned in an article saying that they had been told that both parents died in the disaster and they had already decided to adopt Joan Gay and were on their way to Woodward to get their niece when they discovered she had disappeared. Perhaps when and if they did find out her father was still alive and searching for her, they were afraid to come forward for fear of going to jail for kidnapping. Along the same lines, maybe Joan Gay was taken as a replacement for a child someone had lost, perhaps in the tornado. It wasn't unheard of back then to want to get another child when one of yours had died, especially if they thought this child was now an orphan. I can't help think about the baby brokers that were pretty active back in the 1940s as a possible theory. I'm not sure which state she operated in, but I do know that Georgia Tan, one of the more infamous baby brokers of that time, was thought to have kidnapped and sold at least 5,000 children during the years of 1924 to 1950. She was known to get them from parks, prisons, and hospitals, sometimes even bribing hospital workers to help in obtaining the children. It is also said that white children with blue eyes and blonde hair were most sought after. It wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility that one of the baby brokers would send men dressed like rescue workers to a hospital to take a few children in the midst of the chaos of a tornado. Joan Gay did have blonde hair and blue eyes and was said to be an uncommonly beautiful child, so she would have been much sought after in that disturbing business. Another theory I've seen mentioned is Joan Gay was kidnapped for ransom. Only no ransom was ever requested. The mysterious men did specifically ask for the Croft children, but the only biological child of Olin Croft was Joan Gay. That could explain why the half-sister was never taken as well. It could have been a plan to ask for a ransom for her, as Olin Croft is reported to have been a somewhat wealthy, successful sheep farmer. Perhaps the ransom was never requested because of the erroneous reports of his death in the tornado initially. Another reason the Croft children were requested and taken could be someone who thought a lot of Olin Croft and believed him and his wife both perished in the tornado and wanted to be sure his biological daughter had a good home. It does seem that Joan Gay Croft specifically was targeted, but the question remains, why? Another motive for kidnapping Joan Gay could have been of a sinister nature. Perhaps two predators noticed her and how beautiful she was and wanted them for herself, and she ultimately met with foul play. I was surprised to find there was a report of a little blonde girl who was found battered and beaten in California the summer of 1947. There was a slight resemblance, and it was initially thought to have possibly been Joan Gay. Upon further investigation, this turned out to not be her, and she was ultimately identified as Mary Jane Medlin, whose case was also featured on Unsolved Mysteries. So there you have the story of the very mysterious disappearance of Joan Gay Croft. Was she taken in some sort of nefarious plot, a crime of opportunity, or was it someone who had compassion and thought they could give her a good life? Even though it is possible that Joan Gay Croft could be alive and well today, it seems we will never really know what happened that day and why. There was a vortex that not only swept up the city of Woodward that day, but Joan Gay Croft as well. Did she lose her life that fateful day, or just her identity? That concludes the podcast on Joan Gay Croft. If you enjoyed it, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find my podcast on Spotify, Amazon Music, iTunes, and iHeartRadio under one word, Lost and Found Podcast. I release a new episode every 2 weeks. You can reach me at lostandfoundpodcast@yahoo. And remember that cold cases stay cold because their story stops getting told.